Habakkuk 1, I'm beginning at verse 4. We read, "So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. So justice goes forth perverted." And this is God's answer in verse 5. "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on, and their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence. All their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it, and they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God." Well, this is our epic passage for the morning. This is prophetic literature. This is in the book of Habakkuk, and many Christians, I find, are unfamiliar with this. If you were following along, there are a couple natural divisions, which I'm going to point out before we just talk about some of the things in the text. Certainly verses 1 through 4, we often think of as a break here because this is Habakkuk's first complaint, or this is what he's taking to God. We have God's reply as the rest of this text that we read. But there seems to be a transition here at this word Chaldeans, right? So this makes up God's reply. And then from here on, we seem to have description of this word here, or this people group here of the Chaldeans. So that might be how we would section at least subsection what we're talking about. We have the end of Habakkuk's speech, the beginning of the Lord's speech, and even God's speech is divided a bit into an answer and then a description, poetic description. Guys, thoughts on what you are seeing in this passage? Let's talk maybe even repetition or things that are very striking to you.
Yeah, one of the things that just strikes me, Dave, as you're reading it, is just the repetition of various images. I can point to a couple of them. And in verse 8, there's these comparisons with horses are swifter than leopards, they're more fierce than evening wolves. Later down in verse 8, it says they fly like an eagle. There's a number of these different images, and so it's a very visual passage, which I think maybe for our listeners as well as myself, it makes it more challenging to understand. I don't think we often think maybe as poetically as this sort of passage comes across.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about those descriptions. There's a lot of imagery in here. This is actually why one of the reasons I believe people shy away from prophetic literature in general. Certainly apocalyptic literature as well that we read in Revelation. A lot of it is very foreign to us because it's so image heavy. Yeah. Yeah, just the repetition of the word "like" I think is what you're picking up on. Yeah, other thoughts?
Which indicates a simile.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And they love to do this, especially this form of literature that we're speaking. Whenever it's prophetic literature that comes forward, that's a part of it. That's part of the game.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that really caught my attention was sort of repetition of sort of the ego kind of words in here. So verse 7, their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. So it's sort of they're defining their justice, they're defining their dignity from themselves. And then verse 11, it's their own might is their God. There's sort of this this pride about them. 10, at kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh.
Yeah, even that proudly on in verse 8 as well.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, they laugh. Yeah, even things that are not their own, but they're yet dreaded and fearsome. Well, yeah.
But I think particularly verse 11 is just kind of the capstone of the whole thing. They're like their own strength is their God.
Yeah. Own might is their God. Wow, what an interesting, what a terrifying portrayal of these people, huh? Yeah.
There's a lot of terrifying words in there. You pointed some of these out, Dave, and starting in verse 7, they're dreaded and fearsome. Verse 8, they're fierce. Verse 8, they devour. Verse 9, they all come for violence. So there's a number of these terrifying and really, I think intentionally so, frightening words.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of speed, speed kind of words. They're this hasty nation. And, the horses are swift, so they're swifter than leopards. They fly like eagles, swift to devour. Where's the other one? At verse 11, they sweep by like the wind. It's just this speed at which they just go and conquer.
Yep, faces forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. But they do it from afar, but they're swift. Yep, this idea of like, oh, they're coming in, they're gone, right? Gone away with your stuff. Yep. Yep. Yeah, hasty. I think I missed that. That bitter and hasty nation march through to seize dwellings not their own. Yeah, and all of what you guys are highlighting, just to be clear, is a description of this people group, the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans. So we'll put this together here in a little bit, but real quick, Chaldeans. We don't really talk like that. It's a group of people. If you're not real familiar, that's a synonym for the Babylonians. Okay. That's a nation of Babylon. And at this time, that would be a little bit of a shocking answer, because, so like we said, if this is a 7th century book, at this point in time, Israel, God's people, they're kind of positioned between superpowers, other countries that are very, certainly, of course, everybody knows Egypt is a nation that's to the south of where God's people are in the Promised Land. But there's also the Assyrians, who kind of are the superpower in this day and age. And now we're hearing this name drop, the Chaldeans, that's synonymous with the people of Babylon, okay? These are people who live in the east of where Israel is, which is why if you read Hebrew literature, bad things always come from the east, okay? And they go from the east up north down into the south of the land of Israel, okay? That's the path in, at least if you just look at the geography. So Chaldeans, Babylon, right? Would that be the people group? And we have this interesting description of them here. Yeah. One other repetition that will be certainly significant to see is now before even this description, in verse 5, we learn a little bit and we get some glimpses into God. So first thing that we need to see is that, remember, in verses 1, 2, 3, 4 is Habakkuk speaking to God. Habakkuk is this dialogue prophetic book. And in verse 5, we have these commands. We get 4 rapid-fire commandments. We have look, see, wonder, be astounded. Those are imperatives. So now you got to realize that Habakkuk has just said, God, what's going on here? Because where is justice, right? That was the complaint. What's up with your justice? Aren't you going to do something about your people in Judah? These are God's people. There's no justice in Judah. And God's answer here is now, look, see, wonder, be astounded. And again, we also have repetition of I am doing, I am raising up. And those are other verbs that we see ascribed to the Lord. Yeah. Any thoughts, guys, on what we learn about God? Let's just sort of think about the Lord here for a minute from verse 5 and verse 6, because we get a picture into Yahweh in how he interacts with Habakkuk. Let's talk a little bit about that. What can we understand about the Lord? And I'm going to ask this question regularly as we read Habakkuk. What do we learn about God?
One of the things that seems very clear that God wants to communicate to Habakkuk is that what God is doing is much bigger than what Habakkuk can even fathom. Like he's saying, look, wonder, be astounded, but you won't believe. Like what I'm doing is bigger than you could possibly imagine, and bigger than the way you think about things in the world.
The whole world. Well, you said two things there, Lincoln. One is that what God is doing is, it's certainly bigger than what you can imagine from your limited point of view, right? But one other thing I heard you say there, which is really important, is wrapped up in God's answer is, I'm doing something. You're saying both of those things. Because remember, Habakkuk was very much concerned. God, you are inactive. You are not up to anything. And as I look around the world, which is a very relatable thing in the coronavirus world, right? God, why aren't you doing something? And you said two things, Lincoln. One, we realize that God is doing something. But what God is doing is beyond sort of the tunnel vision that you have. right? You said both of those things. Yeah, and I think that's excellent. Yeah, already we could talk about that, but let's table application for a minute. But what else do we learn about the Lord?
Yeah, well, just to make a explicit connection with what you're saying, in verse 3, what we looked at yesterday, that Habakkuk's, accusation is, why do you sit idly by? And he's actually going to repeat that again in the next section. Now, not in regards to Israel, but now he's going to say it in regard to Babylon. Hey, why are you idly allowing these guys to go? I think it does point us to a principle. I think Johnny Erickson taught us that it really well, that she said God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. Because very clearly, these are not good people. Verse 11, these people have no regard for Yahweh. They only have regard for themselves. And yet God is going to use these people that hate him, and that perhaps he has no particular regard for, but he's going to use in their violence and everything to accomplish, what
his purpose
and with his character.
So Q&A time with God. Habakkuk says, God, why aren't you doing anything? And this is God's answer. Oh, I am.
Not warm fuzzy. Yeah.
I'm raising up the Chaldeans. That's God's answer to Habakkuk's question. That's remarkable. Okay. Yeah. Anything else we learn about God? So God uses what he does not like or hates to accomplish what he loves. I forgot how you said that or how Johnny says that. But yeah, we do see that God is using a wicked nation to accomplish his righteous purpose. And now Habakkuk is going to ask some questions again. We're going to see that tomorrow. But already we learn something there. God does accomplish his purpose in ways that we probably wouldn't choose. Yeah. Anything else we learn about the Lord?
This may just be another way of saying what we're saying, but God is consistent with his character, but always unpredictable.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, this might be another thing that goes with that. Maybe this is so obvious that we're not inclined to say it, but if you ever want a picture, friends, of the sovereignty of God, this is it. Mm-hmm. Because think about what God is saying here. Habakkuk is talking about the nation of Judah, right? Northern kingdom, Assyria, leveled. And we have the southern kingdom still here. And Habakkuk is saying, God, what are you going to do about justice? He's asking a more of a smaller question about this little southern kingdom of Judah. And his answer is that on the global scale, God is claiming to be able to rule sovereignly over his people, but not only his people, but over wicked nations. So it seems like the rise and fall of nations are more up to God than they are up to us, right? And that's just that's sovereignty, right? That's sovereignty. Assyria right now is like literally a superpower. And God is saying, actually, I am going to be the one who brings Assyria down, and I'm going to be the one who raises up Babylon. And Babylon is going to come in and exile Judah, which, again, that seems like, God isn't doing this like on accident. This is happening before it happens, and God is saying it. So I think it's a wonderful picture of sovereignty.
Yeah, it's crazy that the sovereignty.
Go ahead, Brian.
That the sovereignty, on a global scale, is to do this work for his people. Now it's a work of discipline that he's doing, but that there is this sort of, divine diligence that God is paying to Israel on a sort of global scale. It's just incredible.
Yeah, global sovereignty. Global. Yeah. Go ahead, Link. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe one other contextual thing that would be helpful for us to remember is that the place God has for his people, Israel, is really important to them. Like that's from the beginning, God has promised that he would be present in a place with his people. And for this idea of exile, it's not like, oh man, we have to take a vacation we don't want to take. It's like, no, the promised land that you have given us, God, you are taking from us. Right. And giving to a wicked, terrible nation. It's the place you promised to be with us that's being destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah, you're bringing up there the shock and awe of this answer, which Habakkuk is going to reflect right after this, the dialogue. Right. But I'm just saying that God's answer right now is, if you know about the Chaldeans, and we're going to, you see the description there, but I'm just saying with what we can learn about the Lord is, man, that's an unexpected thing, Link, is what you're saying. This is the covenant people of God in the land that he promised to Abraham. Now he's saying they're coming in to take a land that's not their own. Yeah. Another thing that we might be easy to overlook here about God is that God actually answers Habakkuk.
Right.
And I think that's something that would be helpful to
Yeah.
acknowledge, because God owes him nothing. And here's a man, it seems like what we learn here back and forth is that Habakkuk, this is a book which is a prophet on a journey of understanding God, even in a way when you can't understand God. We can't necessarily comprehend all of God's purpose, but we see Habakkuk on a journey of apprehending God, of God tipping his hand a little bit. And I think it's just very kind of the Lord to answer him. Yeah. In his sovereignty, who owes this man nothing. So, any thoughts that we learn about Babylon? It seems like they are wicked. We were talking about that.
Yes.
God calls them a bitter and hasty nation. Let's think about God's answer. Habakkuk, what are you doing, God? It seems like there's no justice in your people of Judah. Like justice goes forth perverted, and the wicked surround the righteous, right? He's talking about Judah here. And God's answer is, oh, the wicked are going to surround the righteous. That's
shocking.
That's terrifying.
He uses the same language. Like look at verse 4. So justice and goes forth perverted, then verse 7. And justice and their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. And he's talking about the Babylonians there, and he's saying the justice that you're saying is perverted in Israel is gonna come, but it's not gonna come the way you expect.
Yeah.
Coming from Babylon.
Yeah. And now this raises a theological conundrum. Can God use the Babylonians to accomplish his purpose, right? That's the question. And we're going to see that question raised. If I were Habakkuk, I'd be like, wait a second. God, are you serious? Whoa, that's not what I wanted. But already here, what we can see here is, what do we make of God, I think, where this book is taking us, when God's work or God's, let's say, solution to the problem seems worse than the problem? That's the emotional context of Habakkuk, right? It seems like the prescription is worse than the disease. God, whoa, you are going to bring in the Chaldeans, and they're hasty, they're dreaded. Lincoln, give me a couple of thoughts on why these descriptions are here. Are they just, it's not just poetic. What are some of the reality that corresponds with these images of proud horror?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really trying to incite terror. I think you were pointing this out earlier, Brian, but how swift they're coming. Just the sense I think the reader should get is that they're coming upon you in a moment and you cannot stop them. But they'll overwhelm you. They gather captives like the sand. The people who are entrapped by them are just, you can't even count them.
Yeah.
So
you're going to be overwhelmed with terror. Yeah.
You're going to be overwhelmed. Yeah.
Yeah. Historically, is this talking about like people? Like, what are some things what are the Babylonians like? I mean, it seems like they're fast. They have horses. They have more technology, at least in the day, than Judah would. So fast horses. I'm just trying to put ourselves in and see what this would be like. I mean, wicked men coming on horses to take you away, right?
Well, and even the description in verse 10, that they come up to a fortress and they're like, hey, nice walls, that's not going to stop us. And they just pile up, they build siege works or whatever, pile up the earth and they just go in. That they're not stopped by any of the, the kind of conventional defenses that people would have. I think too, a couple things that tease us into, or give us insight into kind of their mode of operating is the seizing dwellings in verse 6.
Yeah.
And then the gathering captives in verse 9, and basically kind of the taking fortresses and stuff like that. There's another place where it says that they take it, and it might be later on, next section. But there's just a sense that these guys came in and just took it. They just took towns, they took people. Certainly, we know that Israel is going to get exiled. They're going to get carted off as slaves. But Babylon did that in waves. They came in, took a bunch, came back, took a bunch.
Right.
So they're going to lose, not just their stuff, but themselves.
Right. So they take stuff. And it's interesting. So they're not constrained by your defenses. You're outmatched technologically. They have fast horses. They'll just, whatever, gone, your stuff's out. But they're also not constrained by their conscience or by the law, right? So up
Yeah.
here, like they're not constrained by in the law is paralyzed is what Habakkuk is saying. God's people aren't obeying you. And you're like, well, he is going to judge Judah with a people who are more wicked, is the message of Habakkuk, which is jaw dropping and should leave you a little bit unsettled. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. God is not acting in a way that you would ever, ever, ever imagine him acting. And it almost seems like he is, I don't know, it seems like he's going against what he said in the beginning. And how do you do that, God? And anyway, this raises a lot of questions. And maybe I wanted to ask that, and then we'll talk application. Is what questions would this raise about God? What questions would you be wondering about here if you were Habakkuk?
Yeah, I mean, like verse 11, I think sort of presses this tension, like, is God the author of evil here? Because he is in verse 6 raising up the Chaldeans, but he's also saying they are guilty. They're responsible, for their actions, but God is sovereign over this. And so I think you get that tension.
Right. So one question is, God, are you just in executing justice in this way? That's a great question. Good. Yeah. I think one is just, have you forgotten about your people when things seem difficult or unusual, right? Are you going to forget about your covenant promises? That's a real question. You got to put yourself in the narrative here, because this is God's people. He promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to your offspring, I will give this land forever. And through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And the nations of the world are coming to judge God's people. So this is a moment where to Habakkuk, it's like, have the promises of God failed? You got to put yourself in there a little bit and feel that urgency and that terror a little bit. And it's helpful. Let's talk some principles here. We find ourselves in a similar situation whenever we suffer, I think, or whenever God doesn't act according to the script. We find ourselves in a situation maybe asking similar questions. So it's very, very relatable. Perhaps that's why we picked the book. Many lessons in here for God's people. What are some that we should talk about, guys?
I mean, I think that there is an appropriate place to be shaken, by God's sovereignty, sort of the bigness of it. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, the beginning of wisdom, right? That there is a place, that we often try to sort of tame down the word fear and say, oh, it's just respect or it's awe or something. But I think there really is a sense when you come to passages like this that the only appropriate response is a bit of worshipful trembling before God. Yeah. And I think there's a place, you think about this situation, like how fast the world was brought to its knees by a little, microscopic bug, like this little virus.
Right.
And God is over this. God is sovereign in this. That he, when he wills it, everything halts, everything stops. We should tremble at that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what we've been saying at our Kutztown meetings is that psalm that says, let all the earth fear the Lord. We should have that appropriate, shut your mouth, you are not God response.
Yeah, I think just building off that, one of the things I think we can think about God is kind of like, he's kind of like us, but really, really big. And I think one of the things this passage helps us to see is God is not like us fundamentally. Mm-hmm. God's ways are not our ways. He is doing something and working in ways grander and bigger than we can see and understand. And I don't mean that to say, therefore we shouldn't have questions. God gently and kindly answers a question here. But it does mean we should have humility when we ask those questions. Mm-hmm. To recognize that there are limits in our understanding of the magnitude of what this great, all-powerful, all-knowing God is doing in his plan, in history.
Yeah. So maybe worship is an appropriate response. Go ahead, Brian.
I think two other things that comes to mind is one that this gives us a window into how seriously God takes sin. That this is his response to Judah's waywardness. Right. I think it just pushes me to say there's no room to be, to coddle sin or to take sin lightly. Right. I think the other thing it does is that there is a sense where, in a very sober and sort of fear-filled way, that we can be comforted by this because God is using, there's no calamity, there's no evil that happens in the world that's not outside of God's sovereignty.
That's right. Nothing escapes his eye.
Yeah, and so there is a plan, there is an authorship in this, and so God is weaving together the story, and He is working it, and I think as we'll see, He is going to be faithful to His people. It's just going to be through incredibly unexpected, and right, we talked about pruning back in John 15.
Right.
The pruning is going to hurt, like it's really going to hurt, but there is a good, a good behind it.
Right.
I think Isaiah 40, which I think is like maybe a little bit different. He's a little bit later, I think, than Habakkuk, but he's closer to the Babylonian, invasion. And that line from Isaiah 40, comfort, comfort, says the Lord my people.
Yeah.
That there is a promise of comfort coming on the heels of even the severe discipline.
So without even knowing, God, exactly what are you going to do? Which is what a lot of us do. So, like, God, if you were to tell me exactly what the coronavirus is accomplishing in the world, why are you doing this exactly in terms of microcausality? That's usually where we try to find comfort. And God does sometimes tell us exactly why He does what, right? But what you're saying, Brian, is where a Christian should go, and I think rightly, and is this picture of awe and worship of God who is on the throne, who is sovereignly and supremely above all things. And we can look, see, wonder, be astounded, and also trust. I think that's just very, very helpful. Like, we are not God. God is not a giant projection of ourselves, but He is always working. And not just the timeline of like, what's He doing this week? But think about this. Through history, through years of raising up this nation and moving this nation, all for the purpose of His glory and our good. Like, that's the God we serve. I think that's a more helpful picture of what the Bible calls the fear of the Lord.